Welcome to the course History of the Ancient Near East. I'm Justin Singleton, your instructor. Now, for this lecture, you're going to have to forgive me because I have something of a cold and keep having to pause the recording in order to clear my throat. So it may make the recording sound a little bit choppy. Forgive me for that. And just like last time, you may hear my dogs eating, scratching, whining, whatever in the background. So just hang in there with me. Okay. Excuse me. In this lecture, we'll be discussing the third intermediate and then the late periods of Egypt. This third intermediate period is then broken down into 4 stages. Pretty easy divisions, just the 21st dynasty, the 22nd dynasty, the 23rd and 24th dynasty, and then finally the 25th dynasties. Our discussion of the late period of Egypt will be the final period of discussion concerning Egypt before we jump into the third and final section of the course, where we talk about individual time. Okay, now we move back down to Egypt in this study of social time during the Iron Age. This was a move from the 20th dynasty, which is the last half of the Ramesside period, to the third intermediate period. During the Ramesside period of the New Kingdom, the very end of the New Kingdom, Egypt repelled a Libyan invasion. Yet, Libyans still found their way into Egypt, and ultimately became the kings of the 22nd, 23rd, and 24th dynasties. By the end of the New Kingdom, Egyptian kings, they pretty much lost their desire for expansion. This New Kingdom concept of internationalism and going out into the world kind of ended at this point. Now, even with this desire to seclude themselves, the New Kingdom had already brought on this ideal of peace through victory, which included very essential elements of loyal foreigners. Egypt could no longer do these things on their own. And because of this, Egypt became much more pluralistic at this time than really at any point previously. Those 3 great periods of Egyptian history, the Old Kingdom, Middle Kingdom, New Kingdom, all of that had ended. And all that remained was a time of greater instability with periodical stability. The third intermediate period represents the final of the 3 intermediate or lesser periods of Egyptian history, extending from Dynasty 21 through Dynasty 25. Now, as with the previous 2 intermediate periods, the region was marred by division and unrest, as evidenced by the general lack of archaeological material, though, to be fair, later rulers did appropriate many of the period's monuments. Now, it should be noted that although approximate dates are given in the study, the historical framework of the third intermediate period is more difficult to establish than any other period in Egyptian history. Now, still, even with this historical problem of trying to figure out when everything actually happened, this chapter of Egyptian history began a phase of observable changes in both art and culture that lasted throughout the remainder of the final millennium before Christ. The third intermediate period is understood in multiple ways, including 3 distinct cultural phases, namely the Egyptian, Libyan, and then the Nubian. But perhaps a better dissection comes in the 4 stages previously mentioned. The first stage being represented by the 21st dynasty, when power split between the kings and the priests of Amun. Now, after rebellion at Thebes, whereby the high priest of Amun was replaced, going back to the New Kingdom for a moment, the Ramesside period ended, and two Theban high priests laid the foundation of the 21st dynasty, Pianch and Herihor. Now, they did this all before Smendes I became the first king of the 21st dynasty, officially succeeding Ramses XI, who was the last king of the New Kingdom, whose reign ended just a few years before, around 1079 BC. The 21st dynasty is actually understood as two separate lists of rulers, one in the north and the other in the south, yet comprising a theoretically unified state. Now, these are known as the dynasty from Tanis in the Delta region, sometimes called Tanite pharaohs, and a dynasty of the high priests of Amun, who were types of warrior priests from Thebes. The Theban priests recognized the 21st dynasty kings in the north, but they established a border and even built fortresses to protect Theban independence, which had been sanctioned by the Theban gods through the use of oracles. The growth of priestly power began as early as the New Kingdom, when Egyptian kings used the priesthood as a political crutch, as in the case of Hatshepsut, who held the religious position of God's wife of Amun, a title that was linked with, obviously, the god Amun and his city of Thebes. So Hatshepsut utilized her knowledge of temple politics for the sanctioning of her and her nephew's reigns, all before advancing to the throne. After Ramses III, Egypt went through a period of a rapid succession of kings, which very much destabilized the entire state. So from Ramses III to Ramses IX, only 3 high priests of Amun held office, allowing for growing stability in the region where the high priest held more and more power in a world where kings pretty much just came and went. By the collapse of the New Kingdom, the high priest of Amun, who was probably worried of further instability, he went ahead and retained power over the southern portion of the kingdom. In the north, Tanite kings physically moved the capital to Tanis. Specifically, monuments from the 19th dynasty capital of Pi-Ramses were moved block by block to the new capital, rather than creating new monuments, which may speak to the economic instability of the northern region. Further evidence comes from the fictional tale of Weneman, an agent of the Temple of Amun at Karnak, who, on his way to Byblos, was robbed and denied the political respect of a foreign dignitary when he reached the city of Byblos. The fear of Egypt no longer holding the power that it once held. From around the 13th century onward, Libyan migrants had been slowly infiltrating the western Delta region, and not always in a peaceful manner. No doubt these peoples were driven to Egypt for much the same reasons as others, namely famine, drought, and a desire for more. The rather large number of Libyans in the Delta caused political and social changes as Libyan culture and social influences were introduced. Libyans became such a part of the Egyptian community that some of the kings of the 21st dynasty were of Libyan descent. But it's the 22nd and 23rd dynasties that is known as the Libyan period. The collapse of the 21st dynasty and the rise of Libyan rulership may have been due, at least partially, to a cataclysmic earthquake in the region, but we're not exactly sure about that. Now, much of the 22nd through 24th dynasties overlap with one another, causing the chronology to become quite unclear. But the first king of the 22nd dynasty is well understood to be Shoshenq I, a nephew of Orsakan the Elder, who was a 21st dynasty king. Now, of note, Shoshenq I is said to have been a high priest of Amun, possibly correcting that whole division concept from the previous dynasty. And he's known from his stela fragment in the southern Levant and from his multiple mentions in the biblical text where he's referred to as Shishak. During the previous dynasty, as is seen in other eras of scarcity, monuments were often recommodified and reused so that the king could perpetuate, elaborate funerary rites or build palaces, all the things that kings are supposed to do. In fact, the 21st dynasty overwhelmingly reused coffins from earlier periods. Now, conversely, Shoshenq I resumed monumental construction work, reinstating the New Kingdom grand tradition of temple expansion. Shoshenq I would go on to construct the large Bubastite portal, a rather grandiose forecourt and pylon interposed between two older constructions, and where the successful campaign against the Israelite nations are recorded, though this portal was left unfinished. Shoshenq I was able to impose a unity in Egypt through the manipulation of appointed officials throughout the kingdom. But the strong central authority that Shoshenq I had created during his reign splintered under his successors. When the kings of the 22nd dynasty attempted to assert control over the entirety of Egypt, local rulers asserted their own authority in the delta, causing continued unrest. By the time of Shoshenq II, the 23rd dynasty had formed as an independent polity in the Nile Delta. Now, understanding the history of the 23rd dynasty is difficult, as the period is, it's just not very well understood. And the King's List, written by Manetho, the later Hellenistic historian and priest, is almost completely useless, as some of the kings don't appear to exist. Others can't be identified, and at least one of the events noted appears to have been invented much later in history. Now, ultimately, Thebes began to recognize their own pharaoh, forming the Theban 23rd dynasty. And later, the cities of Sais and Leontopolis formed their own monarchies. Sais representing the 24th dynasty, and the latter forming the Leontopolis 23rd dynasty. Now, in fact, it may be better to understand both the 23rd and 24th dynasties as kind of rival factions rather than ruling dynasties, especially as the latter consist of simply two rulers spanning a mere 13 years. The final dynasty of the Egyptian Third Intermediate period represented a major shift in leadership, away from Libyan rulers, now to Kushite, perhaps better known as Nubian rule, a period that would eventually bring the plurality of intermediate period monarchs to an end. Of course, this Nubian kingdom has as its roots its own kingdom of Nubia, a region historically located between the first and sixth cataracts along the Nile River, a cataract being a shallow, rocky, sometimes whitewater areas of the river. Now, during the New Kingdom, northern Nubia was occupied Egyptian territory, up to the Fourth Cataract, and again later by a Theban king during the 23rd Theban dynasty, resulting in a thoroughly Egyptianized Nubian people. Nubian rule lasted from around 772 to 656 BC, and although the appearance of stability may lead one to place the 25th dynasty outside of the Third Intermediate period, this was a rather thinly veiled and superficial unity. Of note, the ideology of the acculturated Egyptian Nubians at the time was centered on Egyptian imperial beliefs about Amun, beliefs that had appeared to die out in Egypt at the end of the New Kingdom. Now, believing these old beliefs to be of utmost importance Within the first 10 years of his reign, Pai, the first king of the 25th dynasty, claimed to be the protector and king of Thebes, the city of Amun, and therefore he was the ideological heir to the Egyptian throne. Now, Tefnakte, a warrior chief at Sais, who formed a coalition of war chiefs in the Delta, and may have been the king of Egypt referred to in 2 Kings 17:4, began rapidly to push southward in opposition to what was perceived as the Nubian threat. Well, Pai expeded northward to confront the coalition, defeating the Libyan kings and chieftains. After the victory, the Nubian king submitted himself as a worshiper of the Egyptian pantheon, demanding that his troops both respect and watch over the temples and festive celebrations. Under the 25th dynasty, Egypt was superficially united under Nubian rule, but the kingdom was still fragmented, and the Kushite kings were contented to leave the political fragmentation. Now, of interest, an army of Nubians and Egyptians was sent to the southern Levant at this time in support of Hezekiah, king of Judah, saving the Jewish kingdom. Some years later, the Assyrians would retaliate, ultimately forcing the Kushite king back into Nubia and bringing an end to the 25th dynasty. The late period of Egypt then covers the final dynasties of ancient Egyptian histories, dynasties 26 through 30, ending Egyptian dominance in the region for good. Now, for the purpose of this study, only the 26th dynasty is of importance, the 27th dynasty representing an introduction to Persian dominance in the Levant and Egypt. Sais, the city of the lonely 24th dynasty, of which Tefnakte, the war chief noted above, was the first ruler, would then move on to become the center of the 26th dynasty, beginning with Psammetichus I. The Sites controlled the western delta after receiving the support of the Assyrians, who had driven the Kushite 25th dynasty back into Nubia. The 26th dynasty begins the time in which Egypt becomes fixed to the Persian, Greek, and Roman chronologies. And the 26th through 27th dynasties are sometimes referred to as the Site-Persian period, perhaps due to cultural contact at this time. A demotic language and script came into use, a language simply called Demotic, and existing as a type of common spoken language turned into a written language, as opposed to the more classical and archaic Egyptian. This linguistic change acts as just one more evidence of the changing society that from that point on would never again hold the same power and influence as it once did. Interestingly, Ezekiel 29:15 also notes that Egypt would never again rule over other nations. And they didn't. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this final lecture on Egyptian history. Again, forgive me for the choppiness. I keep having to cough and clear my throat, and you know how it is being sick. As always, feel free to contact me if you need anything. Thanks for listening.